Hello, hello. Welcome back to another episode of Detection at Scale, Season 2. Today, I'm joined by Thijn Bukkems, who's the threat hunting lead at Grammarly. Really excited to have you on today. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So why don't you start by just giving us a little bit of an overview of what you're working on at Grammarly and in your role there?
Yeah, I'm a security engineer at Grammarly working on the security intelligence lifecycle. The idea is we try to stay ahead of evolving threats and using intelligence to figure out what will happen, what we expect to happen, answer questions like, are we being breached? Hey, we're building this service. What risks can we expect? What attacks can we expect? And then using kind of a combined approach of intelligence, of threat hunting, of threat detection, incident response, and offensive security to figure out what these attacks will look like and also how we can detect them in the various stages.
And let's talk a little bit about the stack and your team processes. And I think every team has their own flavor of how they want to create their own detection stack. What was your mindset going into the creation of your stack?
I think when you join a company, there will be products, tools, and pipelines in place. Sure, you can redesign them to be exactly how you've done it before, but I think more often it's more useful to just look at what you got. Many of these things can be somewhat changed or adapted to fit your need. So when it came to a detection stack, I think what we needed was the obvious detection as code, having a pipeline, having version history to make sure we understand what changed, allowing peer review, which is both, I think, very useful for getting higher quality detection shipped into production, but also as an onboarding task, right? I learned so much always from reviewing other people's codes, understanding their mental model of how they're breaking down this threat and subsequent detective control, and using that to kind of enhance my own knowledge of a problem. Besides that, just using what you have. Many organizations have Git, they have some kind of SIM, they have some kind of logging platform or pipeline or automation set up. So the more of these you can check off, okay, we already have automated log collection set up, all our AWS accounts that get created, ship logs into our SIM. We have a SIM, the SIM has an API, it supports Terraform or something like that. At that point, you have all the pieces you need to build your stack.
So a lot of it is just to repeat back some of what you said. A lot of it is starting where your company is, what architectural choices that they've made in their product, and sort of backing into the environment you were thrown into, and then looking at what the team has existing or like existing security tools, or are you typically bringing everything in?
I think you can look at existing security tools. You can often bring them into the code management space. Usually when you start, there has been some detective effort that's happened in the past. Maybe someone's using a GUI to create things. Bringing all that under code control helps you at least understand, which then lets you do things like calculate coverage or figure out if things are still working. But just starting fresh and ignoring everything that was done before could be an approach you might take, but we don't want to lose the valuable work that the teams have done in the past already, right? There's usually good insight into services, a lot of tribal knowledge that teams have built up over the years, and letting that go to waste would be not beneficial of security engineering time. I think, and this also goes back to using the components you already have. There's only so much security engineering time. You have a team of X number of individuals. You can choose how you spend each hour. Sure, you can take the existing SIM and say, we're going to rip this out and replace it with a new SIM, use months of engineering time, or you can say, I'm going to use this to instead add new capabilities or add new detection controls or add new coverage on the existing SIM. And I think at the end of that quarter, at the end of the year, you just need to do what gives you the best, both short-term and long-term value from a security perspective.
That makes sense. Talk to me a little bit about the dynamic in the team. So you talked about detection as code and all the things that go with that, but is the team structured in a way where you have detection engineering or something similar on one side, and then you have teams responding to it? Or are they blended? Is it the same type of person in your team? Talk me through that, because some leaders think about it as a split and others think about it as integrated. So what side of that puzzle are you on?
I think the side we are on at the moment and the ideal state don't always align perfectly, but there is so much value in having this kind of full stack detection engineer, an engineer that isn't just, I'm going to take a signal, create a rule, ship it, let someone else deal with it, but rather consider the end-to-end cycle of how this incident or how this event is going to be managed. As we do detection engineering, we like to kind of work backwards from the response. So if the alarm, the hypothesis we have an alarm for will fire, what would the response steps be that we take for this attack? Now, as we know how we respond, so we could say, oh, we're going to shut down this, or we're going to change that, etc. We can also get a better understanding of what would this attack look like? In what kind of attack would we see this alarm trigger? And then we can further go deeper and break that down. Okay, so we're having an alarm with the attack of some privilege escalation thing through IAM roles or whatever it might be. How does that fit into the greater kill chain? What is the objective of this privilege escalation? How did we get to a stage where we had the identity for the privilege escalation? And figure out what other steps there might be that you can detect besides just the privesc step. Kind of go from this atomic, here's the detection, here's the response, to a greater, here's the attack we're thinking about, the adversaries we're thinking about, and building a playbook and the detection control or multiple controls that deals with a less atomic attack, but more of a risk or threat in general. So having those functions combined, detection and response and hunting, and to a degree intelligence and offensive security, right? You need to think about, how would I attack this? I know my service, how would that work? I think is the right approach. If you silo too much, you will get to a certain degree in the state where you just do your own little component level thing, which might work great, but you're missing the bigger picture and it's not going to be effective in doing the thing that you actually want to do, which is protecting your data, protecting your uptime, your crown jewels, all of that.
That makes a ton of sense. I love the concept of working backwards from response. I actually just wrote about this in a blog, so I'm glad that you called it out. And in the blog, I effectively sort of lay 3 things out that good rules need. One of them is to like track high confidence behaviors, right? First of all, it's like we don't want to get alerted on stuff that is we're not super confident about in the monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
We care about monitoring relevant tactics and techniques to our org, which is something I'm about to ask you. And then having clear triage steps. And then I think when you sort of combine the 3, you get like really high quality rules that have intention. And that itself like really helps. So when you think about grouping and thinking about the logical playbooks and threat modeling, and what's your mindset for grouping rules together? Is it based on an attack that we've seen in the wild, that there's research? Is it more about following the kill chain? Is it more about internal threat modeling? Like, how do you group them?
I think in my mental model, there are multiple dimensions that we need to inspect to figure out what the right grouping is, right? So you can think about the first one is always, is this a undifferentiated problem or a differentiated problem? Is this a problem that the entire industry has, like common off-the-shelf malware or crypto mining or something like that? Or is this a very company-specific problem? Do we have a specific process? Have we built a specific in-house service that does specific things that we can then model attacks on? With undifferentiated problems, again, going back to the concept of security engineering time is finite. We don't have unlimited time. In many cases, vendors can give us pretty good coverage. These are like out-of-the-box rules that your SIM has, maybe Sigma rules that exist, maybe a product like GuardDuty or an EDR. They give us fairly good, not perfect, but fairly good base level of coverage against the problems everyone has. So when it comes to spending the finite time, I like going deeper into the differentiated part, scaling through vendors for the undifferentiated part, and understanding really what is this product we're trying to build? What does our business do? Right? And understanding, and I guess to a degree hypothesizing and trying attacks against that service. And eventually you'll get to a point where you understand the bottlenecks, right? If you've looked at 10 different in the wild attacks that do drastically different things that either target your stack or your vertical or something like that, and you overlay those on your specific implementation, you're going to realize that in every single of your hypothetical attacks, you're jumping through these 1 or 2 or 3 bottlenecks. That is the macro level analysis that is super valuable when it comes to figuring out how to group attacks, because you now understand the different paths. There's a path that targets CI/CD, right? A set of attacks that target CI/CD to get to objective. There's a set of attacks that target developer laptops to get to objective. That's how I like to group those, which also then gives you really good inspiration of where to put the detections that pay the largest dividends because you target those bottlenecks.
That makes a ton of sense. So the idea is that you want to offload as much as possible on the commodity stuff to the vendor, which makes sense. And then most of your effort is around what's unique to us based on our technology and our process and our people. And then going back, a prior question, you mentioned having this like full stack detection eng team. Are they predominantly working in code? Or is it a combination? Or like how much of a developer is a detection engineer in your mind?
I think it depends on the various phases they're working on. I think you can mature detection and response and hunting individually, where each has a different level of code dependency. And it also depends on how analytical/researchy the work is versus how production ready the work is. I think things that protect your business that you rely on, such as detective controls, right? We expect this detective control to be in place. We expect that if this happens, we will be notified. I think that needs to be highly code oriented. Otherwise, we can't reason over it. We can't prove that it works, right? If we just did something in the GUI, but we have no way to test that, we don't know if it changed, we don't know if it's still there to begin with, or someone typoed something and saved it. Those assurances become very difficult to make. And if we can't give those assurances, then we don't really know much about our security posture. For other things like response, we need to balance the frequency of an attack against the impact. So on the one hand, you can say, if this is a very high impact attack, where if it happens, it could have significant damage to the company, we need to be able to respond quickly. Therefore, we should have some level of code, some level of automation built that can quickly take these actions. Otherwise, we will lose the race against time. But if it's a medium or low impact attack, something very early in the kill chain, perhaps, that also is very unlikely to happen, maybe it doesn't make sense to spend days of dev cycles coming up with a fully automated response plan, because it's not going to happen. Probably it's one of those alarms that you hope never fires. And when it does fire, it's relatively easy to do so manually, and it doesn't justify the cost of the engineering time.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Those two elements are really important for prioritization too. It's like the Eisenhower matrix, right? Like importance and urgency, and then you just don't do the things in the bottom left quadrant. Let's talk a little bit about security intelligence. So this seems to be your main focus. Is this more in the realm of looking at active attacks in the wild, picking IOCs, looking for hits? Or is it more about what we were talking about on developing detections that are unique to your org? Because I could see sort of stories for both. But tell me like a little bit about the charter of that team necessarily.
I think we're mainly worried about or concerned about giving the business the right inputs on a strategic level to educate them on what to focus on, to build intelligence into their decision-making process, rather than the atomic indicators, even though that's also very important to do. But I think if you would summarize kind of the process of the charter of what we try to do, is we try to ask questions. For example, something like, are we being breached? Or is an attacker currently trying to get access to our crown jewels? Based on that, you can create hypotheses like this is happening in this kind of a way. We focus on collecting evidence. Like what kind of data would we need to answer the kind of question? So if we want to know if we're being breached, we need to enumerate all the different systems we have, all the different access points, all the different logs, really just create an understanding of how would we even know, which is a very end-to-end problem rather than a component specific. It's not like, let's only look at CloudTrail, and if we look at all CloudTrail and we understand CloudTrail, then we will know if we have been breached. That's not true. We need to first understand what all the different ways are, and then conduct an assessment on all of those at the same time. From there, we can come up with an action plan. We need to ask questions like, do we maybe know what a payload would look like if we saw it on the network logs? Do we know what a malicious role assumption would look like? Do we know if we even have the data to look at this? Do we have the logs for this? Do we have the logs for that? Which then turns into a sort of an action plan of, okay, we need to collect this log, we need to collect that log. We know this is what an attack looks like, so we need to be able to look at this. Then there comes the implementation part of it, which is both something we do ourselves when it comes to the detective controls. We can develop those, we can test those, we can launch those, as well as work with the other teams to implement some kind of hardening components where appropriate. And finally, I think the most important part is the analysis of, do we have the answer? And the answer is almost, do we have a conclusive answer to this question? And the answer is almost always no. No, we do not know fully if this answer has been fully answered. But now we went from we don't know anything at all to we know these components, and we also understand what the gap is. So it's a bit of an iterative approach there of taking a very broad question that spans almost every single area of the business and making incremental progress towards answering that.
That makes a ton of sense. And then when you think about optimization, where does automation fit into this gap analysis typically?
I think the automation fits into almost every part of the collection stages. We need to understand what data exists, where a lot of enumeration happens. Sure, we can go click through all the GUIs every single time, but many of these questions in different areas have similar data sources or similar data collection processes. One of the things we found, for example, is in many cases, the IAM relationship graph is very useful in answering specific questions. Now, generally, these kind of graphs don't exist, or these graphs exist for some components that you can just download from the internet, like cartography, but they don't quite integrate with the very specific stack that you have at the organization. So that's where the automation and development component comes in, where you try to define those relationships for your proprietary systems or your whatever you have, and load them all into your graph so that the next time you ask those questions, you can move faster and you have this information already available to get quicker to your desired question.
So to sort of put a bow on our conversation, based on your experience, based on the work at Grammarly and in your prior experience as well, like what are 3 pieces of advice that you'd have for people building a program like this?
I think the main one is don't silo yourself. Yes, you might have been hired as a detection engineer. That doesn't mean all you should do is take detection signal, pump out detections, and call it a day. I think going beyond that, embracing the depth and the complexity of a problem, really understanding the service you're trying to protect, talking to the engineers that maybe working with that kind of service, what they normally do, really allows you to make a better detection or make a better detection stack in many of the cases. Because in almost every single instance of going down a path like this, you think you have hypotheses at the beginning, and what you have learned at the end is drastically different than where you started. Skipping that step will result in you having to do it again ultimately, plus just a not good use of your time.
That's a good one. I love the idea of bigger thinking, Awesome. Well, is there anything to plug, anything going on? Are you guys hiring, expanding your team? Anything you want to plug to the community really fast?
We're always expanding our team. We're always looking for more security engineers. I think we've got lots of interesting data problems to work with, product problems to work with. And we're really looking for, I suppose, builders and engineers that are willing to just take a problem that's as ambiguous as it might be with a business that's moving fast and figure out how we can do this securely.
Awesome, Thijn. Well, I really appreciate having you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on and for dropping a lot of great knowledge on how you're building security at Grammarly. So if those want to learn more, check out your LinkedIn, look for their job posts. And yeah, thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me.